what the hell? I accept a challenge from him again.
Some women, like this one, will rule men out on height alone. Hollywood's Taylor Lautner got obliterated in the comments on this picture.
OMG met Taylor Lautner. OMG. Not okay.
He's so little. What the heck, huh?
His height completely killed it. Wow. This is kinda sad.
OMG. How does that even happen?
I'm 5 foot.
This is Stu, and Rob, who's 5'3", and David, 5'6". We recruited a few taller men and put them in lineups behind a two-way mirror. Then we invited groups of women to choose a date. Since doctors are hot, we gave Rob an MD. The ladies' choice?
Andrew. I would say Matt, I think.
No, Rob. We upped the ante and told the women that besides being a doctor, he was also a best-selling author and champion skier who just built his own ski house.
Does that affect your choices?
He's still short.
So what would it take to get a date for Stu at 5 feet? We made him a millionaire.
No.
Not for me.
Nothing.
Ooh, I asked up that fucking whore.
Too short?
We asked if there was anything Stu irresistible.
Maybe the only thing you could say is that the other 4 are hers.
Maybe the only thing you could say is that the other 4 are hers.
Coming up, we start to look at the race red pill.
Do white girls like black guys?
Yeah!
But is this just virtue signaling to not look shallow?
Yes. No, she hesitated. That means a no.
We dig deeper. Listen to the traits that this Asian man seeks in a woman.
Like, there was this huge barricade whenever I saw blonde hair, blue eyes, and, like, you know, the crest-like smile. I was terrified.
But he's about to get brutally red-pilled.
I tend to go for taller guys, and my type tends to be...
We'll find out what in the next part. As promised, the cheating dating experiment. Just because a woman is dating a below average or average looking guy doesn't mean that she isn't looking to monkey branch directly into the masculine arms of a better looking mate. How the fuck can you be under the illusion that men's looks aren't majorly important to women when they even matter to an extent to other heterosexual men?
He's an insecure little bitch. Soft. Emo. Wears a hat every battle because he's bald. Chemo.
How easy is dating for below average looking women? And later, what can you do to improve your looks? We're just getting started.
Get cosmetic fucking surgery.
Sexy.
This lecture is called Virtue as a Necessity. And the reason I gave it that title is because virtue, ethics, morality isn't a field of study. It's a mode of being upon which all fields of study rest. It's also a mode of being on which everything you do in your life rests. The way you understand yourself or fail to, the way you understand other people or fail to, and more
You
deeply
son
than
of
that,
a bitch.
what role it is that you play in your life, in the world.
Fuck you.
One of the things I've learned, for example, being a clinical psychologist, I spent thousands of hours helping people sort out difficult problems, is that lack of virtue makes people ill. I'm not saying that my clients themselves lack virtue. I suppose some of them do and some of them don't, but to the degree that they're embedded in a network of relationships where virtue is fundamentally absent, they're tortured and tormented and they're unable to find firm ground. And that's not a biological problem, even though biologically fragile people might be hurt more by a lack of virtue. A lot of what you do in a real relationship with people, and at least to some degree a clinical relationship is supposed to be real, is provide a forum where people
Let me ass up that fucking...
And that's hard because people don't like to tell the truth, particularly. The truth is difficult. It's
Let me
difficult
ass
for
up
a
that
variety of
fucking
reasons. So,
son of a
when
bitch.
I first thought about this lecture, I had a slightly different title. The title was Virtue as an Existential Necessity. And that's a bit philosophical, so I modified it. But there was a reason for that, because the concept of virtue means to be virtuous, and existentialism is the study of being, right? And I think that you can't really understand what makes up virtue until you modulate or modify your notion of what constitutes being. This is a hard thing to do.
Fuck this shit.
Modern people are fundamentally materialistic. And there's some utility in that. We're masters of material transformation. And the fact that we're materialist in our scientific philosophies has made us extremely powerful, maybe too powerful for our morality, extremely powerful from a technological perspective, but it's blinded
Man, this
us
is
to certain
fucking
things.
bullshit.
And I think one of the things that it's really blinded us to is the nature of our own being.
No.
Because we make the assumption that the fundamental constituent elements of reality are material. We fail to notice that the fundamental constituent elements of our own reality are not material. They're emotional, they're motivational, they're dreams, they're visions, they're relationships with other people.
Man, I think I've lost this fucking
They're
game.
dependent on consciousness and self-consciousness. And we have absolutely no materialist explanation whatsoever, either for consciousness or self-consciousness. And we don't deal well from a materialistic perspective with the qualities of being.
I think I've lost
And
this
everyone
fucking
knows
game.
those qualities exist. I mean, for most people, there's nothing more
I need
real
to ass
than
up some
their
of
own
those
pain.
fucking poems.
Right? Pain transcends rational argument in that you can't argue
Right.
out of it. It's just there.
I need to ass up
And
some of those fucking
materialist or
poems.
not, there's very few people that are willing to allow the claim that their pain is merely an epiphenomenon of some more fundamental material process.
I got rid of that fucking son of a bitch.
And I think that unless you understand that, you can't think properly about virtue. So I might start the discussion of virtue with the discussion of being. Well, what does human being look like? Well, the Buddhists say life is suffering. That's the first fundamental Buddhist dictum. And I suppose a modern person would tend to think of that as a very pessimistic claim. But I've found when I've shared that information with my students, once they understand what it means, it's actually a relief, because people run around madly suffering away, and all of them inside their little shell think, well, there must be something wrong with me, because here I am suffering, and that isn't how things are supposed to be. Well, then you might
Get that
say,
fucking
who says
phone
that's
out of
not
here,
the
you
way
son of a
things are supposed to
bitch.
be? The Buddhists say life is suffering. So what that means is if you're not suffering, that's a good thing. That's lucky. That's fortunate. That's not the way of the world. That may be something to be grateful for.
He can't take that poem because he does. If he takes that fucking poem.
A positive symbol in any way. It's a symbol of betrayal by friends, opposition from the state, and mortal vulnerability. It's about as
Suck off that
symbolic
fucking.
representation of the idea that life is suffering as you can put together, which is of course why the power of that symbol extends across several thousand years. Judaism, well, I don't think it's going to come as a shock to anybody in the audience that Jews are acutely aware of the suffering that's involved in life. So it's useful to know, to understand what it means that life is suffering. It's a fundamental ontological truth. It's a fundamental statement about the nature of being. And there's a reason for that. It's not incomprehensible. It's perfectly comprehensible.
No.
We're finite. Right? We have a lifespan that's bounded temporally. You're going to live maybe 100 years, and that'll pretty much be it. And then there's other forms of extreme limitation that are imposed on you that have very little to do with you. They're arbitrary facts of being. You're a certain height, you're a certain weight, you're a certain amount of attractive, you're a certain amount of intelligent, you're a certain amount of athletic, you're a certain amount of mentally ill.
Yeah, I think I just fucked
You're a
up.
certain amount of predisposition to cancer. And it's frequently the case that people like to attribute those vulnerabilities to some
Get that fucking.
flaw in their own nature, but what they are instead are conditions of existence.
Get
Human
that
being
fucking rook out of here, you
is
son of a
predicated
bitch.
on a kind of fundamental limitation in that we are what we are and we're not other things. And so that means inevitably that the awareness of human being comes along with suffering. And life poses the question. How to conduct yourself in the face of suffering. Not only yours, but everyone else's. And it's an inescapable question, except that maybe you're fortunate and you'll have periods of time where something absolutely horrible isn't happening to you. Now, you think about this. because you might think this is pessimistic, but it's not pessimistic. It's actually one of the most freeing things that you can realize. Maybe there's nothing particularly wrong with you at the moment, but there's a high probability that you have a family member that has something seriously wrong with them. And there's a very high probability that if you don't, you will soon. Or maybe you'll have a partner that has something serious wrong with them. And to know this frees you from the false illusion that life can be conducted without suffering. Suffering's an integral part of being.
Oh,
now,
no. Fuck you. You're not going to pull that fucking shit.
Question. But I have some ideas about that have helped me, and they're things that I've read.
You are not going to pull that fucking shit on me.
About reason for creation. It's like a Zen koan, this idea. You take a being with the classical attributes of God, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience. Right? It's a totality. And the question is, well, what does a being with those attributes lack? And the answer is limitation. And then you think, well, what's so important about limitation?
You just fucked up.
There's no being because everything is one thing. There's no differentiation between things. So something that's absolutely total has no being. It has to be parceled out into limited being. And you know this because you'll all play games. You play video games. You play games with other people. You play games you don't even know you're playing. And when you play those games, you put limits on yourself. You play by a set of rules. And the reason you do that is when you limit yourself arbitrarily in some ways, whole new worlds of possibility emerge. And so there's a powerful metaphysical idea that being is not possible without limitation. So that's an interesting question. That's an interesting idea. So you say, well, what's the price you pay?
I need to ass up these fucking
poems. The price you pay
poems.
for being is limitation, and the price you pay for limitation is suffering. So the price you pay for being is suffering.
Stupid.
So what's the problem with that? Well, suffering makes people question the validity of life. Right?
Son of a bitch.
If something terrible is happening to you, you're going to wonder why you, that's for sure.
Son of a
why
fucking
not you
bitch.
might be a better question, because it's inevitable, but you will wonder that, why you? And you'll wonder, well, is it worth it? Especially if what's happening to you is terrible and prolonged. Is it worth it? Does the cost that you have to pay for being justify itself? And therefore is being justifiable. And everybody asks and answers these questions. In fact, the process of asking and answering those questions underlies everything you do all the time. Because you're answering, when you act, one answer, which is yes, being justifies itself, and you're answering a different way sometimes when you act, which is no, being does not justify itself. And the question then might be, what happens when you answer one of those two ways? Well, to untangle this, the first thing I want to do is to talk to you about the antithesis of virtue. Because it's always struck me that when you're talking about something that could conceivably be regarded as optimistic, it's difficult for people to fundamentally believe you. You know, if I stood on stage and said, well, the purpose of life is to be happy, you might find that vaguely comforting, but there's not a chance in the world that you'd believe it if you have an ounce of sense. Because if you've lived, you know that there will be periods of time where happiness is not your state. And so there has to be more to life than happiness, because there'll be a lot of your life that isn't happy. Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the book, The Gulag Archipelago, was one of the axes that brought down the thick tree of communist utopianism, said of the idea that human beings are made for happiness, he said that's a philosophy that's undermined by the first blow of the work assigner's cudgel. And what he meant by that was, if you find yourself in a particularly terrible situation, if you're enslaved, for example, by malevolent utopians, and they're pushing you into a form of slavery, and they're beating you to attain their ends, the idea that you're made for happiness is not going to be a much comfort under those circumstances.
No.
And so Solzhenitsyn's point was, you're weakened by your belief that life is for happiness, because that philosophy cannot sustain any sustained challenge, and you will for sure encounter such a sustained challenge.
Son of a bitch.
I don't think that modern people can believe in virtue, but not easily, because virtue sounds religious in a sense, and we have real trouble, whether we're religious or not, with religious preconceptions, because our scientific forms of knowledge and our fundamental materialism has really radically undermined our ability to believe in any transcendent being.
No.
But one thing that modern people can believe in, I think, without much difficulty at all, is evil. Solzhenitsyn said, for example, that the most important event of the 20th century, as far as he was concerned,
stupid.
And you may know, should know, that after World War II, a group of National Socialists from Germany, who were deemed particularly responsible for the absolute horrors of the final solution and the mass factory genocide that accompanied it, were put on trial. And a standard defense for their actions was, well, I was ordered to do it. And the Nuremberg decision denied human beings, regardless of their ethnicity or national background or beliefs, the legal right to use that as a defense under certain limited circumstances. And the argument was, there are some things that are so self-evidently not good, not virtuous, that if you engage in them, you're existentially guilty. You're guilty.
Man, this guy's stupid. This guy fucked up.
There's a transnational and trans-ethnic morality. We don't know what it is, but we know what it isn't. It isn't pointless torture and genocide. At minimum, to be virtuous is to live your life in such a way that the probability that you would engage in such actions, given the opportunity, is minimized. Now, people think, well, they're already doing that, because if they were in Nazi Germany, they would have been a rescuer, not a perpetrator. But that's wrong. You could take this audience and put them back in 1939 or thereabouts. 90% of you would, 95% of you, 99% would either be in the perpetrator class or the going along with the perpetrator class. And you may sit and believe that you'd be in the 1%. Maybe you would, because how do I know? But that isn't how the historical facts sort themselves out. And it turns out that it's not that difficult, generally, to put people in a situation, normal people, where they'll do something that really doesn't look very good. People who are familiar with psychology know about
Son of a
pilgrimage
bitch.
experiments, for example, know about the Zimbardo
I was kicking his ass.
perfectly normal college students, and
But I ran out of fucking time.
into a situation that they know
That
is
fucking pisses me off.
real. Give some of them the power of prison guards and make some
That fucking pisses me off. I was beating his ass.
shut the whole experiment down because
I ran out of fucking
guards have
time.
turned into Nazis, and they're enjoying torturing the prisoners, even though
Son
they
of a
know whatever
bitch.
known that they're innocent. Well, that says something about the manner in which people conduct their existence. They're very susceptible to malevolent action. If you look at Genesis, very old book, very influential book, there's a strange sequence of events that befalls Adam and Eve. Right? It's in 2 sentences. A snake gives them an apple, and that wakes them up. Well, there's a good book by a Southern
Son
California
of a
primatologist
bitch.
just published last year that
Was
suggests that the
Pit-
reason that humans have such great vision, way better
Was
than most
Pit
animals, except for
smelly
rabbits,
shelly
birds,
cause you run?
because
With
our
spit,
visual
spit,
systems were
spit.
designed to detect predatory snakes. And the way she discovered that was
With
by
spit,
comparing the
spit,
populations of
spit.
predatory snakes around the world to the visual acuity of the primate
With
groups that lived in those
Pit
areas.
smelly
What she found was
shelly cause
essentially
you
a
rhymes.
correspondence. Our visual system, which is the ability to see,
With
let's say,
spit,
because
spit,
enlightenment, for
spit.
example, is associated with vision. The snake gave that to us because we had to pay attention to predatory things that were after us for tens of millions of years. And fruit, that's interesting. We have color vision because
smelly
we were
Shelly,
predators.
'cause you
Our color vision
rhymed.
was
And
precisely
nothing wrong with her name.
evolved to detect ripe fruit. So that part of the story is right.
With spit, spit, spit.
There's a story that involves women too, but I'm not going to tell that one today. You have to be awake to outsmart women. That's the story. And so that's why they're tangled in there with the serpents and the fruit. What happens when Adam and Eve wake up? Well, it's a series of strange things. The first thing that happens is the scales fall from their eyes so they can see. All of a sudden they're awake in a way they weren't before. And the next thing that happens is they realize they're naked.
With
Now, one of the things that people
spit.
have nightmares about is being naked on a stage, which is often why when you see people on a stage, they don't tell you anything they think. Because they don't only not want to be physically naked, they don't want to be metaphysically naked either. And they protect themselves from the inquiring eyes of the audience.
Shelly.
No one likes to be naked on stage. Why? Well, to be naked is to have your defenses stripped from you.
With
When the Soviets wanted to really torture the hell out of you at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'd stave in your door, and then they'd strip you and shave you when they got you to prison, because once you were
smelly Shelly,
exposed
'cause you
in
rhymes.
suffering catastrophe, then you were much easier to torture. To be naked,
With
to realize you're naked, is to realize that you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. That's why Adam and Eve immediately cover themselves up. They realize they're naked, they cover themselves up. It's a story about culture. Once people woke up and realized their limitations, their mortal limitations, which is often known as death, the first thing they do is cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens is they know the difference between good and evil. And that's a strange thing. It's not good and bad. It's
Son of
good
a
and evil
bitch.
specifically. It's also something that animals don't know. And I thought about this really for 20 years. What is that?
With spit,
And then
spit,
earlier
spit.
this year, I think I figured it out. I think what it means is you don't know how to torture people until you realize that you're vulnerable. As soon as you're self-conscious of your own vulnerability, then you can take what
With
might only be a
spit,
predatory
spit,
act, say on the part of a wolf, because a wolf will bring a moose or something like that and eat it, and drag that out into
Son of a bitch.
3 months of artistic torturing. And so that means that your
With
recognition of your own vulnerability
spit.
immediately allows you to determine what's evil.
With spit, spit,
Well, then you
spit.
might ask yourself, well, under what conditions would
With
you be likely
pit,
to
smelly Shelly, 'cause
manifest
you
that
rhymes.
drive? Well, I think that's easy to figure out if you watch yourself. You know,
With spit,
if you watch
spit,
yourself
spit.
without presupposition, which means to watch yourself honestly, or to watch yourself as if you're someone you don't know, because you don't know yourself, because you're too complicated to know yourself anyway. So you might as well just come right out and know that.
With spit,
One of the things
spit,
that's kind of
spit.
useful about recognizing
Son of a
for evil,
bitch.
if you can do that without traumatizing yourself, is that it's the pathway to recognizing your ability for good. You don't get to one without the other, because you have no idea what you're like.
God damn it.
Not only that, you won't take yourself
Sorry.
sufficiently seriously. If you know you're a loaded weapon and an unstable loaded weapon, then you're much more likely to pay attention to what you do. But that means you're not particularly nice. And it means that if you were given an opportunity, maybe you would have been in the Nazi prison guard. Now, in Genesis, the first thing that happens after Adam and Eve wake up is they have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain, who's Abel's brother, he doesn't get along very well with God. Now, I don't really care if you believe in God, because I don't know what people mean when they say they believe in God anyways, but the story goes that Cain doesn't get along very well with God, and the reason for that is Cain keeps doing things, and they don't work. Everything Cain touches turns to ash, whereas his brother Abel, God likes him, God only knows why, and everything goes real well for Abel. So Cain is kind of a failure, and Abel's a smashing success, and not only is he successful at everything he does, but he's a good guy too, which is really rude, because if you're really successful at things, you should at least be wretched personally so that people can forgive you. So So Cain takes it for, a decade or two, and then he's just had it. He's had it with God. He thinks, how could God make this sort of universe where I'm, breaking myself in half here and getting nowhere, and my brother's doors open for him left, right, and center. So he goes and complains to God. He says, look, what's going on here? What sort of reality did you conjure up here?
Spit.
Abel has it good. I'm having a miserable time.
Spit.
And you think that's pretty interesting, that Cain would think that, because you have to ask yourself, what sort of presumption does Cain have to assume that the dismal quality of his being is attributable to God? Because what Cain does in that instant is to make himself the judge of being. And I would say that you should be cautious about making yourself the judge of being, because there's always the possibility that there's a few things that you don't know. So God sort of lets Cain in on the secret. He says, look, the fact that you're suffering miserably away actually isn't my fault. It's your fault. He says to Cain, sin crouches at the door like a predatory cat ready to jump on you, but if you wanted to, you could overcome it. This is not what Cain wants to hear. Cain wants to hear that he's an innocent character.
Spit.
It's all God's fault. And God says instead, straighten the hell up. You know you could do it. And even though you know you could do it, you won't. And so that's that for Cain. He was upset when he first went into the discussion, but after
I got him assed up.
Then he's out of the realm of human, and the story says his countenance falls, which means he's angry and upset. And why?
Man, I fucked his ass good time there.
Cain has already judged beating. The best way that he can express his desire for revenge is
I fucked his ass good time there. I fucked his ass.
Arbitrarily eliminate them.
I fucked his ass hard there.
There's some interest to note that
damn, I didn't even expect that.
Grandchildren is the first person who makes weapons of war. So that brilliant little story so long ago associates the moral failings of the resentful individual who's unwilling to take responsibility for the nature of their own being directly
with spit.
Atrocious acts of social conflict.
With spit.
That's another thing to know, because if you're going to be virtuous, you have to take yourself seriously. If you start to understand that you're networked with people, you're not one
fucking
little dot among 7 billion.
That
you're
fucking shit.
Networked with other people, so you know 1,000 people, and they know 1,000 people, and so you're 2 people away from 1 million people, and 3 people away from 1 billion people. You're in a causal network, and all of your actions matter. As Solzhenitsyn said, there's as many centers of the universe as there are individual consciousnesses. And that's a very interesting way to think, and why can't it be that way? We don't know anything about consciousness, and it certainly seems to be how it feels if you're one of those conscious centers, and so maybe it's what matters.
Smelly Shelly, 'cause you
I think that often people come to the conclusion that life is meaningless, because that's a better conclusion to come to than the reverse. Because if life is meaningless, well, then who cares what you do? But if life is meaningful, what you do matters. Everything you do matters. And that puts a terrible responsibility on the individual. And I think that people are generally unwilling to bear that.
Good, I'm gonna get rid of those fucking knights. Not fucking bishops. With spit.
So being has a structure. One of its fundamental structural elements is suffering, but suffering produces other characteristics of being. Resentment is a characteristic of being. People feel resentful when they believe that they've been taken advantage of.
With spit.
Maybe if you feel resentful, it may be that you're being taken advantage of. It may also be that you should screw your head on straight and look at things properly. And it may also be that you should talk to somebody to find out if you're being taken advantage of, or if your head just isn't screwed on straight. But to talk to them, then you have to tell them the truth. And in order to tell them the truth, you have to have practiced being honest. Because if you haven't practiced being honest, then you're not going to have a friend you can talk to. And even if you did, you won't be able to tell them what the problem is. And then they won't be able to help you sort out whether or not you're being taken advantage of, or whether you're a little bit insane.
With spit.
resentful, then maybe you have to tell the person who's taking advantage of you that they should stop doing it. And maybe you have to tell them in a way that will make them stop, which is no easy thing. Or maybe you're resentful because you're a nasty little bit of the world.
Let's ask him this fucking...
You know, you have a chip on your shoulder, and no matter what people do with you, you're resentful.
Well,
in which case, you have some internal restructuring to do. And you might ask, well, why should
let's start asking up some of these fucking poems.
Along with hopelessness and nihilism and all sorts of other moral pitfalls, puts you on the road to cruelty and atrocity.
No.
Misery loves company. And if you feel that things are fundamentally unjust and that the slings and arrows of being are aimed specifically at you, why should you treat anyone else with compassion or justice? Because things are fundamentally unfair. And even more deeply, why shouldn't you conclude that things should be eradicated because fundamentally they're unfair? Now, I think that's what Hitler concluded. I also think that's what Stalin concluded. The evidence suggests that Stalin was gearing up for the Third World War. I mean, he had hydrogen bombs. He'd already killed 30 million people. I mean, he had his practice trials. And, you know, there's an old psychoanalytic idea, and the idea is you can't understand the motivations for the behavior. Look at the outcome and infer the motivations. So, Hitler killed 100 million people if you include the whole Second World War, and God only knows how many Stalin killed, and Mao killed more than Stalin. Why? Well, their cover story was utopia. And I guess people believed that. Well, why? It didn't look very utopian when all those millions of people were dying. I think all those people who participated in those processes used their rational utopianism as a cover story for their willingness to participate in the atrocity. Because what they wanted to do was participate in the atrocity. They didn't give a damn about utopia. Then you ask yourself, well, you know, how much do you try to force the world to behave according to your terms? You know, the Catholics always had trouble with rationality, and modern people, especially the sort of hyper-atheists that you hear from now and then, they don't like that because they believe that rationality is the highest virtue, and that's wrong. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say in a university, except maybe the university isn't here to teach you to be rational. Maybe it's here to teach you to be virtuous. And those aren't necessarily good. And the rational person says, well, I understand that
I asked up that fucking...
I impose an order, and then I work to make that imposed order a reality. That's what every ideologue does. It's what every utopian does. It's convincing, and I think the reason that people do that is because they, well, it's complicated. Partly they want an explanation for their being, but more importantly than that, they want a mask that covers up their tendency to atrocity with the appearance of virtue. And most utopian thinking is of that sort, even though the mask can be very well argued. And you ask me why I believe that, and the reason I believe that is because we had 100 years of it, and that's how it turned out. One of the things that was terrible about living in the Soviet Union was that you couldn't suffer because things were perfect. So if you were suffering, and you even admitted it, then you were instantly an enemy of the state. So if you're an ideologue, your own suffering makes you a heretic, right? You undermine your belief in your own bloody system by suffering. Well, and that's fine. If your belief has stopped you from suffering, well, more power to you. But if you're still suffering a bit, or a lot, or a tremendous amount, then you can ask yourself, maybe there's something I don't know.
Son of a bitch.
Here's an existential exercise. So, and this is not rational. You say, let's assume that virtue is worth pursuing. And I say it's worth pursuing because a virtuous path is the only path that justifies being to itself. That's the definition of virtue. A virtuous path justifies being to itself. Being is suffering. So you need a justification for your suffering. So then you might ask yourself, are there times in my life when I feel that my suffering is justified? And this is a good question. And you could ask yourself the reverse question too, which is, are there times in my life when my suffering is clearly not justified? And I can say, well, watch yourself for 3 weeks. Just watch, like you don't know anything.
No.
And see when you're somewhere it justifies.
I pulled victory out of the jaws of defeat.
You're not self-conscious. You know, it's not good to be self-conscious, right? It loads on.